Once again, thank you so much for participating in these lectures. This is lecture number 7. The topic is history of the Freemasonry in Scotland and England between 1717 and 1813. Those are years when contemporary or Freemasonry has started existing in the form as it has now. And it is very interesting to see the historians, Brother Bob Cooper's perspective on these issues, uh, to deliver us the nuances, how he sees the history of the Grand Lodges unfolded. What were the reason behind these decisions? What were the context of the historic context of these happenings? Who were the main players? And then we will follow up with our questions. As always, he graciously gives us a lot of time to question his lecture and see what is wrong there, what is right there, what else we can do to understand better the historical events. So once again, I would like to welcome every one of you on behalf of Grand Lodge of Georgia and Grand Lodge of Lithuania, or individual members of these Grand Lodges, and Brother Bob, I guess, as well. Also, some brothers from UGLE who are actively supporting this initiative, spreading the word around. And I want to thank them as well for their invaluable support. Um, just small announcement that we've been discussing with Bob that maybe we will be able to deliver 16 more lectures till the end of June. And if you can bear with us, I think there will be always something very interesting going on. We'll share the calendar, details, dates, topics, everything. In addition, I would call any one of you to share the topics that you want to be discussed, because right now we will be preparing the agenda sort of for Robert. And we will be able to accommodate many of the topics that will be shared here in the chat, or you can share it through the emails that you already have, and we'll try to somehow synchronize and get 16 very interesting topics from about the Freemasonry. Um, I'll mute someone. Okay. Just to inform you, another small announcement is that Brother Ben from Brazil is trying to find out the way from UGLE. He has been advised that there is technical possibility to translate online lecture into Portuguese or other languages as well, as far as I understand. And if that will be the case, then we will try to accommodate that technological advancement as well into our initiative, and try to simultaneously kind of translate this lecture into Portuguese, maybe in other languages. We just have to try with Ben, and we're on it eagerly. And my team over here will do our best to give all the access, or just follow the technical advices from UGLE guys to deliver these very interesting lectures to Brazilian audience as well, and brothers who have like challenges regarding the English language. The same thing is regarding Spanish. We received several requests from Argentinian brothers, and most probably we'll do one or two lectures translated, not technological. If it's technologically done, then it'll be by default available for everyone, but we will have a translator who will translate, and we will try at least once, so it doesn't take too long, and if it is comfortable for Spanish speaking brothers. We'll go through this a bit later. As I told you, we're open for your topics. Our teams will generate new agenda for 16 new lectures that are being done. Um, I should remind several things to the participants. Uh, Abraham suggested during last lecture that at the end of the lecture we all should have a glass of wine with us. So if somebody will be missing it, he will be banned forever from the lectures. So take good care of it. You have plenty of time to prepare some drink with you. So that's it. And I would remind before I give the floor to Robert that Robert shared with us a challenge during last lecture regarding the measurements. So after the lecture is over, if any brother had a chance to look through rituals or history books, or just gives us his perspective on what he thinks those measurements might mean, you will be more than welcome. So we don't forget anything. It's in there. And in addition, we discussed with Bob that maybe it'll be an interesting addition to the lecture if at the end of each lecture we get some sort of small, very simple quests we can think of during before next lecture comes in, and share our perspectives on it. In universities, they use this peer-to-peer method, which is very useful and efficient. So this might be something similar. So I would like to ask Brother Bob to think about the kind of small quests or historic ones or ritual ones which we might which motivate us to think and go through the texts again and again. So, having said that, it is my pleasure to give floor to Brother Robert Cooper again. Floor is yours, and I mute myself. And I first of all I mute everyone because I see some microphones are not off. And then you unmute yourself, Brother Bob.
There we go. All
Yep.
right. Good. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I say that David and I seem to be the two main characters on this thing, so I hope you find it interesting. I've had a couple of inquiries already asking what the image behind me is, and that's, of course, that's Freemasons Hall in Edinburgh at night. So it's floodlit, and in case anybody's wondering about the colour of Grand Lodge, the corporate colours, if you like, are green and gold. Nothing to do with the Irish flag. Green and gold was chosen primarily because green is the colour of the Order of the Thistle, which is the highest chivalric order in Scotland. So it's thistle green, or supposed to be thistle green, and gold, of course, being the most precious metal. So that was a way back when Grand Lodge was founded, and that was the colours they chose. And the museum, which is this floor behind me here, on the second floor, that's where the museum is located. And on the other side of the building, there's the library and the archives. So that's just to let you know what the photograph is. The subject tonight is going to be a bit shorter, I think, than previous talks. When I looked at the YouTube recordings, I was kind of staggered to see that I'd been on a couple of times talking for about an hour. And I didn't realize I talked that much, frankly. That's because I tend not to have a clock or a watch lying around, because I find that a distraction. So, you're really going to have to sort of say to David, "Oh, shut him up, will you?" If I start rambling and going on for too long. But that's just the way I do it. I just talk. What I would say is that there's been all sorts of very interesting questions that have come up on previous presentations, and we will try and get round to answering them all. The one on this measurement that was in the oldest ritual, 3.5 feet or 42 inches, roughly what, a meter and a quarter or something, has got me thinking. I wondered whether it was perhaps something to do with King Solomon's temple, and so I put a post up yesterday making a comparison between Rosslyn Chapel and the dimensions of the chapel with the dimensions of Solomon's temple, hoping that I would get this sort of really lovely explanation of what this was in our ritual, but unfortunately it just it didn't work. So anyway, the comparison between Rosslyn Chapel and King Solomon's temple is on my Facebook page if anyone wants to go and have a look at that. So yes, so as David calls it now, we're probably going to be giving you all a bit of homework from now on, so that especially on subjects that I can't answer, and believe me, there's lots I can't answer. That little example of 3.5 feet is one. There's all sorts of other things we can talk about, as well as that, as David has said, if there's any particular topics that you would like to hear about, that you think I can deal with, then obviously that's worthwhile. And we may have one of these lectures or presentations which really just deal with all your inquiries. And I think that would be a kind of nice discussion one evening, where between now and then, whenever that might be, if you've got any particular subject or questions or whatever that you would like to ask, then as I say, I hasten to add, I'm not going to say that I'm going to be able to answer them all, but between us, David and I, and I'm sure others, we'd get something for you. So that might be an interesting way of widening out what happens here. A little bit of audience participation, if you like, rather than just you guys sitting there enjoying your drinks and listening to me ramble on and on and on. So tonight's presentation, really, I'm going to be focused very much on the Scottish dimension, because I think the two subjects, Scotland and England, is going to be way too big and way too long for me to deal with in the time we've got. But that's what I'm saying now. By the end of the presentation, I may well have drifted into other subjects as well, as you already probably have noticed. So up till now, what I've been talking about is my particular interest on what has happened, what happened before 1717. What was going on before 1717? And I think I've explained that as a historian, we all see this phenomenon where things just don't happen, or very rarely happen just like that. There's always some kind of evolutionary process that takes place historically, and that culminates in one particular event. So lots of examples. The Russian Revolution, it didn't sort of start at 9 o'clock at night on Monday of last week. There was a lot going on well before the revolution took place. And the same thing happens with the establishment of the Grand Lodge of England, we think, or it's said, to have taken place in 1717. My interest up till this point in time has been what happened before 1717, and that gives us a lot of information about what was going on in the lead up to the establishment of the Grand Lodge of England. And so a little bit of a recap before we get to what was happening. And as I say, initially I'm going to be talking about Scotland, but we know that in the early part of the 18th century, we had a whole variety of lodges here of what we will call different types. We had the operative lodges, which were certainly the most dominant here in Scotland, but we also had the mixed lodges, which were stonemasons but dominated by this time, dominated by members who were not stonemasons. And the classic example, which I will come back to shortly, is the Lodge of Aberdeen. And then even a little bit later than that, we then find we've got lodges here in Scotland, which are nothing at all to do with the craft of stonemasonry. And in fact, we would now call them entirely speculative lodges. That is, with a membership of just people like me and no other kind of members, if you like, no stonemasons, just entirely people like myself. And that, the epitome of that kind of lodge was the Hotfoot Lodge, founded in 1702. So that was the best example of an entirely speculative lodge, as I say, founded in 1702 by members of the local landed gentry, but with no stonemasons involved. And yet, for one reason or another, and we'll probably never find out now, but this speculative lodge wanted nothing to do with this new speculative Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of Scotland. And we don't really know why. We've got a good idea why other lodges weren't interested, but why this speculative lodge didn't want to be a member is always probably going to be a mystery. But when I say things like we're probably never going to know, then that's probably a clue to you guys that you can go away and see if you can find out, because, as I said, I don't have all the answers. And, you know, people like yourselves may well know what was going on. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress. We have recently, we've had a very interesting historical development here. When I say here, not in Edinburgh, but in the Masonic world, where two eminent historians, Professor Andrew Prescott of the University of Glasgow and Dr. Susan Summers of St. Vincent College in Pennsylvania, I'm sure it is, have been researching the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England. And I think they came to, their approach was, given the 300th anniversary of that body not that very long ago, they were looking at this well-known phenomenon. When I say well-known, it's a well-known phenomenon within the academic world, the academic history world, where organizations have this almost inbuilt impulse to establish a foundation myth. And that's certainly very true of Masonic organizations. A foundation myth is usually almost like a manifesto of what the organization's all about, what their intentions are, and what's more, creating a kind of legitimate history and going back as far as possible to make that history very, very legitimate. And therefore, with age comes the attributes of wisdom, the attributes of being respectable, being the oldest and the best, and all the rest of it. So most organizations aspire to have a wonderful foundation myth. And on that basis, everything then follows. And every kind of human organization has a foundation myth of some kind or another, particularly organizations that have a high moral content. And so obviously religion, or churches in particular, have theirs, and so on and so on. So Professor Prescott and Dr. Summers looked at the foundation myth of the Grand Lodge of England, and much of that was centered on Anderson's Constitution of 1723, and more importantly in many ways, the second version of the constitutions, which was in 1738. So there's two texts relating to the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England, both of which are very important in their own right, but we're going to talk about a little bit about both of them, but more importantly, we're going to look at, briefly, the work of Prescott and Summers. And I think if anybody hasn't read that, we can certainly give them a reference to the book. I might even be able to find the text. I was going to ask Andrew Prescott if I could put this on Facebook until I read it, and it's far, far too long, far too big to put on Facebook. It might go on Facebook, but you'd probably get fed up reading that before you even got fed up of me talking about it. So we'll work out something else to let you have that text. It's very important because it is a much more modern take on the events of the 1710s, 1720s, 1730s. And it gives a completely different explanation for what was going on in Britain at that time. And the curious thing about this is that, and again, you really need to read it to get the detail. And that's why I'm not going to go into enormous detail about it, because it's one of these very meticulously written pieces of historiography. It's, from a historian's point of view, I find it wonderful. It's very eloquent and very, very well researched. But the crucial point, and I don't hope this doesn't count as a spoiler, like we see a spoiler for TV programs and things. Actually, the result or the conclusion of their research is that they have very, very grave doubts as to the accuracy of the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England being in 1717. Now, what they come up with, and there's detailed reasons why they come up with this, their conclusion is that it wasn't 1717, but in fact it was in 1721 that this event took place. Now, 1721 probably means that the Grand Lodge of England are going to have another celebration next year, 300th anniversary for the second time, but that's unlikely. But you see how difficult it is once you've got a foundation myth that's firmly embedded in the psyche of an organization. It's incredibly difficult to shift, regardless of what factual information you might find to throw doubt on it. Anyway, their conclusion then is that it comes down to 1721 and not 1717. And as I say, the reasons and the reasons for that conclusion, you really need to read their extensive paper on it. And I'll not spoil it more for you than explaining that. But I have to say that that conclusion has major ramifications for what was happening here in Scotland. And this is simply down to well-known facts having to be reinterpreted. And that is simply that on the 24th of August, 1721, that is something like 2 months after the first meeting, the first meeting being the one that Prescott and Summers believe was the first meeting. 2 months after that very first meeting, one of the authors of the constitutions, Theodophilus Desaguliers, a Huguenot Protestant from France who was now living in exile in London. Theodophilus Desaguliers comes to Edinburgh in August. So as I say, barely 2 months after the first and meeting of the Grand Lodge of England. So what he was doing here that's important. But before that, before explaining that, the meeting on the 24th of June, and note the date, 24th of June, 1721, St. John the Baptist Day, was not in any way a ceremonial. It was essentially a business meeting. There is no hint of any kind of ceremony taking place. There was no conferral of a degree, but they did appoint their first, or according to the records, they appointed a Grand Master. I'm not going to say it first, but they appointed a Grand Master and thereafter had a meal. So that meeting in June, 24th of June, 1721, gives us no information whatsoever about any kind of Masonic ceremonial, other than they seem to have been doing what we would recognize today as getting people into positions. So in that knowledge, June, and then just a couple of months later, we get to the 24th of August, where Desaguliers appears in Edinburgh. And he's in Edinburgh and requests a conference with the master and wardens and members of the Lodge of Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel number 1. Now, those of you who have heard me rambling before will know that this lodge is the oldest lodge in the world, which still exists and has the earliest minute. There's lots of qualifications in there, but quite simply, their written records begin on the 31st of July, 1599, and they are continuous to the present day. Every single meeting that they've held between July 1599 right up until the present day, they have a record of. So in many ways, this is a important lodge, and I'm not, at this point, I'm not going to get involved with, is this the oldest lodge in the world? I'm merely stating that it's the lodge still in existence with the oldest minutes, okay? And you can see I'm kind of hedging my bets with being very precise as to what this lodge is. But this lodge did meet in the capital of Scotland, Edinburgh, and Desaguliers was living and working in the capital of England, London. So I don't think there's any accident as to actually what he was doing. When he came to Edinburgh in August, he requested a conference with members of the lodge in Edinburgh, and they permitted him to come into the lodge and meet with the brethren after having made certain, or satisfying themselves at least, that he was qualified to be admitted to the lodge. Anyway, 4th of August, in the lodge, has a conversation with everyone. And then the next thing we know, and of course, remember, this lodge is recording every single meeting it's ever had, since the very late 16th century. And they record Desaguliers coming to the lodge and requesting this conference, or a discussion, in other words. He wanted a discussion with the members of the lodge. Now, surprisingly, and this surprise comes across from the tone of the minute, within 24 hours, Desaguliers is back at the lodge in Edinburgh with 6 candidates, including the Lord Provost of the city of Edinburgh. Now, that's the mayor, the equivalent to the Lord Mayor of London. The Lord Provost of Edinburgh is one of 6 candidates that Desaguliers has rounded up within 24 hours. And it seems almost certain that for him to do that, he has a very specific purpose. He certainly puts pressure on the lodge, because this lodge is an operative lodge. There are very few speculative Masons as members. And certainly in August, the lodge doesn't meet June, July, and August, because as working stonemasons, they work for all the daylight hours there is in the summer, which, as you know, are a lot longer in summer than they are in winter. And so a lot of work is done during long daylight hours that can't be done during the winter period. So Desaguliers appears at this lodge with 6 candidates. So in other words, there are 7 of them, including himself, and all the other 5 candidates that he brings along with the Lord Provost, who's someone by the name of Thomas Campbell. I'm not going to swear to his first name, but he's certainly a Campbell. And he presents them to the lodge, saying, look, I've brought you 6 candidates, and 6 very important candidates. So this is Friday the 25th of August. And what are the lodge going to do? They've got 6 very, very senior and important civic leaders. What are they going do, give them a cup of coffee and say, well, thank you for visiting. No, they are initiated and passed on Friday evening in the presence of Deseguli. So that in itself is quite impressive. We don't know the motives of anybody involved. All we have is the fairly straightforward minute that Deseguli appears with the Lord Provost and 5 other leaders of the city, and they're duly initiated and passed. Now, the circumstantial evidence for what Deseguli is up to lies in the fact that on the following Monday, so it would be 6th and 8th of August, 5 more dignitaries of the city appear at the door of the lodge, but Deseguli is not with them. So think about that. Oh, and those 5 candidates on that Monday evening are also initiated and passed, and that fact recorded in the lodge minutes. So this is very important and probably a very intense period. The lodge probably wondered what on earth had hit them. All of a sudden, they've got 11 very, very senior members of political class of the city and indeed of Scotland itself, suddenly members of the lodge. And they didn't ask for them. You know, it was Deseguli that arranges this. So Deseguli, let's think about what the peak of the events is. Thursday evening, he comes along and he more or less demands that he gets into the lodge and has a discussion with the members of, certainly the senior members of the lodge, which is done and duly recorded. But there is no ceremony. There is no Masonic ceremony takes place. Nobody is initiated. Nobody is passed. But Deseguli is able to have a conversation with the members of the lodge. And as I say, 24 hours later, here he appears with 6 candidates the lodge are obliged to initiate. Then comes Monday, and Deseguli has left for London. He's gone. But his 5 candidates still present themselves and are duly initiated. So my reading of that, and I think this is not an unreasonable conclusion, is he appears in the lodge on this Thursday night to witness the ceremonial as practiced by that lodge, only to find, of course, that this is the wrong time of year for anyone to be initiated. There's nobody around to have a meeting. That's why there's a discussion, no ceremonial. Deseguli goes away and he gets 6 candidates for which there has to be a ceremonial on the Friday evening, and at which he is present. He is recorded as being present with the other 6 from the city. So he's been disappointed on the Thursday, and he makes absolutely certain he's going to witness the ceremonial on the Friday evening. But as a backup, he has arranged for another 5 people to come along on the Monday night, just in case, I think, it's just in case something has gone wrong on the Friday and he does not get to witness the ceremony, because by the time his second tranche of candidates appear on the Monday night, he's gone. So he seems to have been determined, for whatever reason, to witness the ceremony of initiation and passing as practiced by this very, very old lodge in Edinburgh. Okay, so he's managed to witness the ceremonial before even looking after the next 5 of his candidates. He's left for London, and some people would say he's kind of left them. These 5 people, know nobody in the lodge. Deseguli is the guy that's the link between them and the lodge, and he's not present. So I think it's very clear that that simply is this: Deseguli was determined, come high or high water, he was going to witness the ceremonial as practiced by that lodge, and he did. And as soon as he did, he was back off to London. So why was it so important for him to witness the ceremonial? Well, the argument will be, and I think again, my paper conclusion that the formation of the Grand Lodge of England had been set up, but they didn't know how to perform the ceremonial. So Des Aguilier, either at the behest of others or on his own volition, comes to Edinburgh in order to he's got the ritual for use. It's not impossible that he was wanting to make a comparison between what they intended doing in London with what was actually being done in Edinburgh. So from this we can begin to see that the year 1717, that shift of 4 years from 1717 is making sure that the formation of the Grand Lodge of England takes place 4 years before Des Aguilier pays his visit. Okay, now if that's the case, then clearly there's a lot more to go on here. Now, from a historical point of view, what is again fascinating to me is that all the information for these events in England are contained in the constitutions of 1738, not the constitutions of 1723. So the events in 1717 are not recorded until 21 years after the events being described. Simple statement of fact. That's exactly what the constitutions of 1738 say. They explain the so-called meetings of 1717, and more particularly, in my opinion, of the meetings in 1721. In any event, whatever you might think of that, what you've got to be asking, the question you've got to be asking is, what was Des Aguilier so desperate to find out about when he was in Edinburgh? Why was he so determined to witness the ceremony being performed by the Lodge of Edinburgh? Anyway, so 1723, the constitutions and laws of the Grand Lodge of England are written by James Anderson, a Scotsman, a Presbyterian minister, no less. So he would be a dissenting minister in England. And what we now know is that he was the son of James Anderson, who was master and warden of the lodge in Aberdeen. So James Anderson is raised in a home in Aberdeen where his father serves multiple times as master and secretary of that lodge. And this is the lodge that I was explaining is a mixed lodge. So we have a membership in Aberdeen of senior members of the aristocracy, earls, one duke, professors of mathematics, etc., etc. And in fact, the operative, that is the stonemasons members of that lodge, comprise barely 20% of the total membership. So again, we can see that he's not only brought up in a lodge where the vast majority of people are what we would call speculative masons, not operative masons. The vast majority are speculative masons, where his father records the fact that he is master and warden of that lodge. So it's not unreasonable to assume that James Anderson had some Masonic knowledge gleaned from his father at home, but the fact remains that he was a Scotsman, and it's always kind of nice for the Scots to mention that it was a Scotsman that was required to write the first constitutional laws of the Grand Lodge of England, and indeed the second one in 1738. So here we have this very curious situation where there is a lot going on in terms of creating a foundation myth. And you can read Summers and Prescott's conclusions, neither of whom, of course, are Freemasons, but both are academically well qualified to do this kind of investigation. You can read that and make up your own mind. However, while this is all going on in England, the situation in Scotland is somewhat different. I've already explained that we have these mixed lodges, purely operative lodges, as well as purely speculative lodges here in Scotland. And what happened was that when the Grand Lodge of England is founded, whenever it was founded, there is pressure here in Scotland to have something similar. And that's exactly what happened. The Grand Lodge of Scotland was formed in an identical way as the Grand Lodge of England. And we know this because one of my namesakes, a chap called Richard Cooper, who was an engraver in London, came to Edinburgh and settled here and became quite a prominent member of Edinburgh society. And he was a member of one of the founding lodges, one of the 4 founding lodges of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. Now, we're kind of blessed here in Scotland because of all these written records that we have. And we know that at that time, in 1736, there were over 100 lodges already in existence in Scotland. And how do we know this? Well, very simply because the guy who arranged for the printing of the invitation letters to the foundation meeting kept receipts in order to be reimbursed financially for having the letters printed and posted to all the lodges in Scotland. So the Grand Lodge of Scotland then sends all these invitation letters out to all the known lodges in Scotland. They missed some, we know that because they appeared later, but they sent these letters out to all known lodges in Scotland. And I think there is no doubt that they got a bit of a surprise, because when they held the inaugural meeting on the 30th of November, expecting perhaps 100 representatives from all over Scotland, expecting somebody to be sent from every lodge, or at least a proxy on behalf of the lodge, they were very surprised to discover that only 33 sent anyone to see what was going on. So, in other words, we have a situation where only 33% of known lodges supported or came along to support the foundation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. We also know that of the 33 who came along and listened to what was being proposed, of the 33, 12 of them decided they weren't interested and decided they wanted nothing further to do with this newfangled idea of a Grand Lodge, and they left the meeting and didn't participate any further. So in other words, we have a situation in Scotland where 21% of all known Scottish lodges supported the foundation of this newfangled head office idea. Let's put it the other way around. 79% of all the lodges in Scotland didn't want anything to do with this new Grand Lodge of Scotland idea. So in other words, the Grand Lodge of Scotland got off to a very kind of shaky shaky start, because the idea was to be the head office for all known lodges in Scotland. And I suspect, and this appears to be the case, I suspect they didn't realise that lodges could be different from the kind of lodges they had in Edinburgh, the speculative lodges, and certainly they didn't realise the nature of the lodges that existed in England, the speculative lodges in England. And the reason we come to that conclusion is that most of the 79 lodges that didn't choose to become involved in 1736 were nearly all operative lodges. That is, they were originally operative lodges, but may have had some speculative members, or they were all entirely operative lodges. And they wanted nothing to do with the formation of this new Grand Lodge. And this comes down to a variety of reasons, I think. The principal ones are a matter of independence of the lodges and also a kind of cultural trait amongst the Scots. When you think about it, these operative lodges, and we've mentioned the Lodge of Edinburgh going back to 1599, why would they suddenly want a Grand Lodge to be telling them what to do? So you can see that the first reaction would be, well, why do we need a Grand Lodge? We've been around for over 100 years. Why do we suddenly need a head office? And that'd be a very difficult one for this new body to explain. What good would they actually be to operative lodges? And I can imagine the operative lodges would have been saying, well, you know, we're an operative lodge. What would a new Grand Lodge do for us in terms of finding us work? Would they negotiate contracts with the town council to build schools or what? Or would they find work for us to do in other parts of the country? Or so from an operative point of view, there didn't seem to be any reason to support the Grand Lodge of Scotland, because certainly in a practical sense, in an economic and work sense, the Grand Lodge wouldn't do anything. It was a speculative body. And so, you know, these operative lodges probably said, well, we don't see the point. We don't think there's any need for it. And so that's exactly what happened. These lodges remained independent of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. And in fact, just to mention it for the record, the very last of these lodges didn't join the Grand Lodge of Scotland until 1891, which was quite a long time later. 1891, the Lodge of St. John in Melrose joined the Grand Lodge of Scotland, as I say, in 1891. So you can see this resistance by operative lodges lasted a very long time, right up until the very end of the 19th century. So the Grand Lodge of Scotland had a major problem. Right from the start, it could not generate the support, unlike the Grand Lodge of England, it could not generate the support necessary to be as legitimate as the Grand Lodge of England. And they seem to then have, in order to try and bring all these lodges into the fold, what they've seemed to have tried to do is they've said to these lodges, look, we really just want to be the head office. We're not going to interfere in your local affairs. To me, that sounds like a rather weak argument, and I think the lodges also found it to be very weak because hardly any of them joined. And they remained independent until later in that 18th century. What is interesting is that when they were drawing up the role of lodges in terms of who was the oldest, what they did, and again you can see the bureaucratic reasoning behind this, is they said to all the lodges, well, produce your oldest written records as your proof of age, and we will rank you in order of priority according to your earliest record. Of course, that probably, in reflection, probably wasn't a very good idea, because what we find, of course, is the Lodge of Edinburgh produces things from 1599, whereas other lodges, even although they may have been older or as old as the Lodge of Edinburgh, didn't have the written records that the Lodge in Edinburgh had. And so the roll was compiled with not the Lodge of Edinburgh as being the one, first number one. That honour belonged to Lodge Aitchison's Haven, whose minutes begin on the 9th of January 1599, full 6 months before the Lodge of Edinburgh minutes begin. So Aitchison's Haven is number one, the Lodge of Edinburgh is number two, and the next oldest lodge is Mother Kilwinning, because their minutes begin in 1642. So you can see the new Grand Lodge of Scotland is doing its best to get things organised, but they inevitably are going to upset some people, or some lodges in particular. And of course, they made this approach to the lodges for proof of age, if you like, without thinking that there could be other evidence. So they asked the lodge to produce their earliest records, which they did. But of course, we now know that there was external evidence for these other lodges that would have supported an even earlier date of formation, if you like. So anyway, to cut a long story short, in 1743, after obviously some considerable negotiation, Lodge Kilwinning decided that it didn't want anything to do with the Grand Lodge of Scotland. So much to the Grand Lodge of Scotland's dismay, instead of recruiting lodges to join the Grand Lodge, Mother Kilwinning left and resumed its independence, the independence that it had before 1736. So that must have been a real problem for Grand Lodge, because here we now have this very, very unusual situation, one that exists nowhere else in the world. We have all these independent operative lodges functioning alongside a Grand Lodge of Scotland with its lodges, and now we have Mother Kilwinning also with lodges, and they begin to issue charters to create new lodges. So we, in essence, throughout the 18th century, there are three systems of Freemasonry working in parallel in this country. You have, as I say, the operative lodges, the Grand Lodge lodges, and now you have Kilwinning lodges. And of course, they're all competing for exactly the same candidates. So they're competing with each other. So this is an incredibly messy situation, but nobody was willing, I don't think, to give way. And in some ways, I can understand all the reasons why. Perhaps the most important reason for the operative lodges, I can't obviously, for ritual purposes, I can't go into this in great detail, but let us put it this way. The Grand Lodge of Scotland is now practicing 3 degrees. The operative lodges, as far as we can tell, are working only 2 degrees, and they are named as Apprentice or Entered Apprentice and Fellow of Craft. Now, for those of you who know the ritual in detail, the 3rd degree makes out Fellows of Craft to be very bad people because of what some of them do in the 3rd degree. So what they're being asked to do, these operative lodges, is they're being asked to join a Grand Lodge, a speculative body that's going to make them, as Fellow of Craft members, Fellow of Craft Masons, Grand Lodge is going to be telling them, by the way, you are absolutely terrible people. And another reason, why would you join the Grand Lodge of Scotland just to be told that, all your members are, in our opinion, bad people? So there's a ritual reason for them not joining, apart from the lack of independence, etc. But there's a ritual reason why they wouldn't join. So then, towards the end of that century, something very interesting happens in the operative lodges. The mark degree appears. Now, when that began, nobody's ever going to be sure, but the mark degree appears towards the end of that century. And for those of you who know that particular degree, you will know that Fellows of Craft are redeemed in that degree. So their redemption, their condemnation, that takes place in the 3rd degree, their redemption takes place in the mark degree. And the mark degree in Scotland is usually worked in the lodge, the Blue Lodge. And so we have a system of 4 degrees here. But it wasn't, this is Scotland we're talking about, so none of this was simple and straightforward. The French Revolution takes place in 1789, and the aristocracy, as you all know, are the ones that they could get their hands on, are sent to Madame Guillotine, and they all lose their heads, their lands are repossessed. Those of them that could managed to escape, and a lot of them came to Britain, England in particular. And so there was a lot of major concerns in the establishment of Britain that the revolution, the French Revolution, might be exported to Britain. There's a great deal of fear that that revolutionary attitude would take root here and would lead to a revolution taking place in Britain. And so the government of the day decided they were going to have to do something about all sorts of organizations that may be plotting to overthrow the government. Any group that might be harboring seditious thoughts or actively plotting to overthrow the government were under suspicion. And that included Masonic lodges, but that was probably a fairly small number. They were also interested in reading societies, organizations, for instance, called the United Irishmen. Any organization or any group of men in particular, any group of men that met behind closed doors and no member of the public could attend. And especially any of these organizations that required an oath or an obligation to be taken to be admitted to membership. They were all under suspicion, and the British government passed laws requiring, they were called like the Unlawful Societies Act and the Secret Oaths Act. Forgive me if that's not the exact titles of them, but these are the laws that were enacted in order to try and make sure that any of these organizations were actually loyal to the crown, loyal to the establishment. And how they achieved identifying these as being loyal was they had to register with the local magistrate, with the local law officer, and by doing that, they would know who the members were. That was very cumbersome. So then what they did in terms of the Masonic organizations, the government required that every Grand Lodge vouched for its lodges, okay? And that meant that they only had one point of contact, the Grand Lodge of Ireland, founded in 1725, Grand Lodge of Scotland and the Grand Lodge of England, all were the places where the government went to ask for proof that the lodges under the Grand Lodge were loyal to the crown, loyal to the establishment. That created a huge problem for the likes of Mother Kilwinning, because Mother Kilwinning was not a Grand Lodge, although that can be debated, but Mother Kilwinning certainly wasn't recognised by the authorities as being a Grand Lodge, and they had a problem. The law, if they couldn't be vouched for, the law said that they had to be disbanded. They could no longer meet as a lodge. And of course, Mother Kilwinning by this time had chartered dozens of lodges all over the place. And the thought of all these lodges suddenly becoming outlawed in the eyes of the law and become condemned and liable to who knows what, having their property seized, perhaps even considered to be seditious and put in prison, caused a huge problem. So this in some ways caused a problem for these independent lodges, but it also gave the Grand Lodge of Scotland an opportunity. The Grand Lodge of Scotland said, well, if you want to be vouched for by us, the Grand Lodge of Scotland, you're going to have to join. We're not going to vouch for independent lodges. So, and then we had a sudden rush of lodges. There had been a few after the appearance of the marked degree. Some of them joined Grand Lodge, but the main impetus was from an external source, pressure by the government on Grand Lodges to vouch for its daughter lodges. So in order for them to be brought on board, Grand Lodge decided that everything needed to be tidied up. So in 1800, Grand Lodge, on the floor of Grand Lodge, pronounced that Freemasonry consisted of 3 degrees and 3 degrees only: entered apprentice, fellow of craft, and master mason. And they put that in writing, and that was sent to every known lodge in Scotland. Scots love putting things in writing, especially when it comes down to money. Anyway, so these things are sent off to all known lodges in Scotland, telling them that there's only 3 degrees. Their charter from the Grand Lodge of Scotland only allows them to work 3 degrees. And if they continue to work something else other than these 3 degrees, and there's specific mention made of, you will not work things like the Royal Arch or the Knights Templar or anything else, because as we've already said, there are only 3 degrees of Freemasonry and nothing else. So how did Grand Lodge know that these lodges were doing these things? Well, of course, because we were writing everything down, they were writing in the minutes, you know, well, we conferred the Knight Templar on Bob Cooper tonight. And so they were condemned by their own records. So when these letters arrived and said, you must stop working these non-Masonic degrees on pain of being excommunicated by Grand Lodge, the Scots simply said, oh, well, okay, right, we'll stop doing it. Of course, they didn't stop doing it. All they did was they stopped writing it down in their minute books. So they carried on as normal, but just stopped writing about it. Right, but the problem was the operative lodges that had joined the Grand Lodge of Scotland suddenly popped up and said, well, excuse me, if there's only 3 degrees in Freemasonry, where does it leave the marked degree that we've been working for at least 2 centuries? And of course, the Grand Lodge of Scotland says, well, we've made a mistake, haven't we? Didn't know about the marked degree. And of course, that reinforced these operative lodges. Well, you know, this is a Grand Lodge, and they don't even know what degrees the operative lodges are working. You know, why should we join? Anyway, to cut a long story short, Grand Lodge had made a serious mistake. They told the world there's only 3 degrees in Freemasonry, but here they are with daughter lodges of their own telling them, no, you're wrong, because we've been working this marked degree for many, many years, and we've got records to prove it. So the Grand Lodge of Scotland, well, very difficult for them to get out of this situation. So they said, okay, right, this is what we're going to say now. We're going to repeat what we've said, but we'll say it slightly differently. Freemasonry comprises of 3 degrees only: the entered apprentice, the fellow of craft, including the mark, and the master masons. So that's 4 degrees by my arithmetic, but they said there's only 3 degrees: entered apprentice, fellow craft, mark, and the master masons degree. So that seems to have satisfied the operative lodges that were working the mark. But you can see that kind of little episode just illustrates the very, very different circumstances here in Scotland. Now, by doing that, and we'll finish on this point, by making that pronouncement that Freemasonry only has 3 degrees and the mark, by actually saying that, they had cast aside everything else that could be considered part of the Masonic family, particularly the Royal Arch and the Knight Templar and other things that were around as well. Now, as a Scot, I find that amazing, because if the Grand Lodge of Scotland had taken possession of all these other orders, as we now call them, you think of the revenue stream that they would have made out of that. But they basically, these Scots are saying, no, we don't want your money, get lost. And I just find that rather bizarre. But there we go, that's what happened. And it was only later that other organisations came along and took possession of these abandoned ceremonials, abandoned by Grand Lodge, that is, and took possession of these other degrees or ceremonies. And that's why things like the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland comes into being, because they were formed in order to look after these abandoned ceremonies, and other organisations like the Knight Templars came into existence, admittedly a few years later, in order to take up these abandoned degrees. So the Grand Lodge of Scotland now has made itself very clear. It believes it has now created a very pure form of Freemasonry, and they do use the terminology of regarding the Royal Arch and Knight Templars as being foreign contaminants imported from outside these shores. So they seem to have been wanting to create a purely Scottish Masonic identity. And in that sense, I suppose they are being very particular in what they see as pure Scottish Freemasonry. And that's why anything else that came along later, like the Supreme Council, the Supreme Council, the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, all these other additions to Freemasonry were very decidedly not pure Freemasonry in the eyes of Grand Lodge. They were foreign contaminants imported from elsewhere. And so here we have this very odd situation now where we've got this influx of mainly operative lodges, many of which have been chartered by Mother Kilwinning. And of course, that meant some of these were very old lodges. That meant that these lodges wanted to have a high ranking on the role of lodges in the Grand Lodge of Scotland. And so that's why, and of course, that caused enormous problems. And to resolve that, we end up with the very strange reason, just always bear in mind we're talking about Scotland here, we end up with a very odd situation where in Scotland there are 3 lodges with the number 1, there are 2 lodges with number 3, there are 2 lodges with the number 38, there are 2 lodges with the number 124. And this was all because as lodges joined, they all wanted to be first or whatever, as high as possible on the roll of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. And every time the Grand Lodge did that and renumbered the lodges, some other lodge would pop up and demand to be even earlier or even higher on the roll. Cut a long story short, eventually the Grand Lodge of Scotland said, no, we're not going to mess around with the numbers anymore. And any other lodge that came along after that decision could, if they proved their antiquity, were given, for instance, a number 2. So you have number 1 in Edinburgh, but that lodge that joined in 1891, a long time after renumbering had ended, that ended up with the number 1 with the superscript numeral 2 to differentiate it from any other lodge. And then the Lodge of Aberdeen, because it was also very old, it ends up with the superscript number 3 against its name. And so this is why we've got multiple numbers. Ultimately, what happened was that Grand Lodge, in its anxiety to bring all known lodges under the wing of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, was they said to these lodges, we will allow you to continue doing what you've been doing at a local level, and we will not interfere. And you'll notice the poor choice of words, we will allow you. And they said, but you can't allow us because we're not members of Grand Lodge. We're an independent lodge. What we'll think about is if we can continue doing that without interference from Grand Lodge, continue to do what we do locally, then we might well join. And as I say, many of them ultimately did. But the consequence of that was that local custom and practice by the lodges before 1736 was allowed to continue. And of course, Scotland being Scotland, any lodge that was founded after 1736 with a charter from the Grand Lodge of Scotland demanded the same level of independence as those pre-1736 lodges. And that's why to this day, the lodges under the Grand Lodge of Scotland have the right to devise their own ritual, and they have the right to choose their own regalia, colour of regalia. So if you come to a lodge in Scotland, you will find, especially if you travel around Scotland, you will find very different rituals from one part of Scotland to another. You will see virtually every colour under the rainbow in regalia, because lodges have the right to choose their own colours. And in some ways, I think that's really quite nice, because it means that as I travel around Scotland, I know that whatever degree another lodge is doing when I'm visiting, I'm going to hear and see something different from my own mother lodge. And that's always a guarantee that I'm going to see that difference. So visiting here it's one of the most popular Masonic activities is visiting other lodges to see the differences between your lodge and that lodge. And of course, Scotland being a small country, you can easily travel around to see those differences. And that's why Scottish Freemasonry, in my opinion, is one of the most different forms of Freemasonry from that which exists virtually anywhere else in the world. So on that point, I hope you found that to be of some interest. And I don't know how long I've been gabbing for, but I hope it was long
It's
enough.
been an hour.
And that you found it to be... You're kidding.
No, everything's fine. Yeah.
Unbelievable. Anyway, so there
You
we
want to
are.
wrap up
Anyway,
and
thank you very much.
we start with the QA.
Okay.
You want to wrap up, do some final words, or you're done?
Yeah, but unlike any other lodge,
do I hear Bob Bed, or is it you as well? Can you?
Yeah, okay. Brother Robert, once again, thanks very much for a very interesting talk. Can you hear me?
Robert, I guess your mic is wrong again. Something's. It's very bad now.
Sound like Darth Vader.
It is with echo.
Let me mute everyone, but it's.
Let me try changing my mic.
Yes, please change the mic. That's.
I'll wait until.
Okay, is that better?
That's
Yes.
much better, Brother Robert.
Okay, Ori, go ahead.
Thank you very much for another very interesting talk. There are many points I would like to raise, but I want to mention two things. First of all, the Professor Prescott's lecture about searching for the Oxford tree is on YouTube and can be downloaded. You can listen to it. It's a wonderful lecture. And the second point I wanted to raise was this visit in 1721 of the Lesegoulier to Edinburgh. Professor Stevenson, in his book, page 35, The First Freemasons, suggests that Lesegoulier was, who was an engineer, was in Edinburgh working for, he was invited to Edinburgh to work for the Edinburgh Council, and he took the opportunity of visiting the Lodge of Edinburgh at that time, and as you correctly say, brought new people into the lodge. But he suggests that Le Desegoulier gave hints and influence to the Lodge of Edinburgh rather than vice versa. Would you disagree with Professor Stevenson on this point?
Yes, that's one of the fundamental differences, Ori, because the guys in Edinburgh had been performing this ritual for over 100 years. So they didn't need hints or tips from anybody else. They had been doing this for a long time. Desegoulier, when he came to Edinburgh, he's first in Edinburgh a couple of years earlier. And again, we've got, things have moved on since David Stevenson was writing this. Desegoulier was a hydrologist, and he was in Edinburgh to advise the city council on a fresh water supply into the city. So he was certainly known to these dignitaries on the city council because he was employed by them as an advisor to pipe water from the Pentland Hills, in fact, into the old town of Edinburgh. The thing is that we know that in January of that same year, January 1721, he was rewarded for completing his advice to the city, and he was rewarded because he was granted what they call a Burgess ticket, which was like being made an honorary member of the city. So he was finished by August 1721. His work was over. He was not here by then to do any work for the city at all. He'd finished it. So he's here to visit the Lodge of Edinburgh. And of course, once he's finished, we know he goes away again. So the reasons for his visit really are probably not all that important, but he seems to have he's undertaken a specific journey to visit the Lodge of Edinburgh. So yes, I don't think Stevenson perhaps sort of looked very carefully at the dates of his attendance in Edinburgh, which are all in the City Council records. As I say, he was finished by January of that same year. So August, it seems like he was coming back for something very specific.
Thank you, Brother Robert. I'll let someone else ask a question now.
Thank you. I'll use the floor for myself. There was, when I was reading through the Origins of Freemasonry of Stevenson, he says that the square and compasses came kind of in 18th century after the Grand Lodges started creating. So these two instruments were not or have not been the symbols of Freemasonry before that. Could you elaborate to what extent this is true, or what's your perspective on it, and why did it change if it changed? And then Ahmed will ask the question. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can answer that with a fair degree of precision. Got to remember that all this stuff, apart from business in a lodge, so like initiations, paying bills, that's all recorded. The ceremony, initiations and whatever, is never discussed in the minutes. It's an oral tradition. So there are no drawings of square and compasses, etc., etc., in Scotland because there was no need for them. The ceremony is given entirely by speech, not by illustration. Okay, but even having said that, I think Stevenson perhaps has missed a couple of points here. We do know that in the things like the Dumfries manuscripts, there are drawings of square and compasses, not conjoined, but there are hand scribbled drawings of the square and compass in some of these old documents. Now, it seems reasonable to me, that you've got two drawings and then later they put the two together to give us the normal modern configuration. But that's a whole new subject, and that's the evolution of the symbolism. The difference here in Scotland was the symbolism, visual symbolism wasn't required because everything was done orally. And even the rituals that we were talking about earlier have got very little in the way of descriptive content. That jogs my memory. We do have a square and compasses from 1714 here in Scotland, and they're actually dated, and we know who owned them, which lodge, and who donated them, etc., etc. So that's one future presentation taken care of for you. I'll give you a talk on that.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Just to split the time fair, Ahmet Emre Demirci, please, floor is yours. Unmute yourself.
Hello. Thank you again for this great discussion. I have a quick question. Can we count the Constitution of 1723 is among the reasons why the schism happened in England in 1751?
My understanding for the schism is that the Grand Lodge of England discovered in the 1740s that, and of course in London where these lodges met, nearly every single one of them met in taverns. so in pubs and bars, it's where they met, they became aware that lots of people were coming into these lodge meetings, and they had passed around passwords and handshakes and were introducing themselves to the lodge and claiming charity, because they said they were destitute, or even, and this is a matter of record, they were obtaining food, because they knew a lodge meeting was nearly always followed by some kind of meal. So if they could get along, join the meeting, they would get a meal in the evening. So that was the motive for these non-stonemasons to get in. And so the Grand Lodge of England decided that, secretly, they decided that on a specific date in the future, the words of the degrees, the first 2 degrees, would be switched. So J and B would become B and J, right? And that, by that mere fact, anyone who wasn't in the know of that change, that is, anyone who was not part of the actual organization to get that information, would be caught out and would then be excluded from the meetings thereafter. And it worked. And very, 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 after that, very, very few records of Cowans getting into lodges in London. Having said that, there were lots of Freemasons that said, but you're tinkering with the ancient landmarks of the order. You're changing something that was fundamental to Freemasonry. And that upset a lot of people, particularly Irish, or shall we say, Celtic Masons. We now know there was a lot of Scots involved in this as well. And when the Grand Lodge of England refused to put the words back in the correct order, these traditional Freemasons said, right, we're having nothing to do with an organization that can tinker at that very fundamental level, and we're going to found our own lodge, our own Grand Lodge, in order to practice genuine Freemasonry, the genuine form of Freemasonry. And of course, because they were talking about Freemasonry from before this change taking place, they were called the Ancients. That is, the ancient form of Freemasonry, whereas these people who had made the change said, well, we're obviously much more modern than the ancient Masons, so we're called the moderns. I'm paraphrasing as to the actual reasons, but that's why you end up with the ancients and the moderns, because there was a fundamental disagreement about changing these elements of the ritual. They simply didn't like it.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Then we have Christian Torres. The floor is yours, please.
Hello, hello there, brother Bob. Well, I want to thank you as always. Your presentations enlighten us, and as I told you before, I just wanted to let you know that we did a presentation on the information you gave us on Saturday, and some other stuff as well. And it was really, really good for a group of about 50 Masons here in South America, from all over, not only here in Chile, but Argentina, and even our brother from Panama as well. So, well, I have to tell you, David was there as well. Chichinatze, and there was a lot of interest in that list that you provided us with the first lodges that started in Scotland, and not many Masons know about that, and that many lodges will fight for the first place, right?
Sure.
So I want to thank you for that and let you know that it went really well. We have a link, we recorded it, and we can provide it to you if you so desire. Thank you.
Thank you. Good.
Okay, thank you. Christian, Norman, floor is yours, please.
Oh, hi, David.
Hello.
Thank you very much. Bob, terrific information, and this period of time hits my interest, quite a lot. I guess that most of the people tuning in here will have different positions in their lodges and maybe in the Grand Lodge in their jurisdiction. And in London, I'm what's called a senior visiting officer, which just means that I have a few lodges under my wing, about 9 lodges that I visit as an official visitor, a friend and a helper to the lodge in times of need. Now, part of the duties that fall on us is to present Grand Lodge certificates to Master Masons, after they've completed their degree and they receive a certificate. And when I do this, when I conduct this sort of nice presentation, I usually preamble it with a little bit of a history of the formation of the Grand Lodge, how it got started, and it usually adds to the interest of the recipients of certificates. So some of the points gel with what you've told us. Perhaps I can just go back a teeny little bit in time. I did know that there was a debate, let's say, between 1717 and 1721, but not being a historian, I read versions which I thought were correct and accurate, and I've given this lecture to many lodges that I've visited, so I hope I haven't been contributing fake news. But to some extent, the formation of the first Grand Lodge, which was actually known as the Premier Grand Lodge of London and Westminster, was actually an accident. Nobody really set out to form a Grand Lodge. The way that it came into being, there were obviously, and from everything that you've told us, the history of lodges going back hundreds of years and records have got scientific, evidence. My reading is that in 1666, when we had the plague and the Great Fire of London, there was a huge amount of reconstruction work in the years which came after 1666. So London then was probably a honeypot for itinerant Masons, around the world, including Ireland and Scotland, and they had their own guilds and their lodges. And this is where some of the foundation is coming together. In 1717, three operative lodges and one speculative lodge decided to have some kind of revival of a feast. I'm not quite sure the name of the feast, but in order for it to be a successful event, these 4 lodges decided, to host it together. And as a sort of almost a side issue, they decided that they would actually form themselves into a Grand Lodge. And sort of there and then, in the 3 months between March and June of 1717, the bones of the Grand Lodge, were thought about. The first Grand Master was Anthony Sayer, and he wasn't particularly prominent. And in fact, he went bankrupt after about 10 years. The second Grand Master was George Payne, a tax collector. And then, interestingly, the third Grand Master was Desagoulier, who you took a lot of time to explain, and who I very much enjoyed your explanation, because I knew just a little bit about him and that he was our third Grand Master, but not the interactions that he had in Scotland. My theory is that in the year 1720, when he was our Grand Master, he was probably an emissary and seeking to take the benefits of the Grand Lodge idea into Scotland. Maybe that's what he was doing at that particular point in time. George Payne became the Grand Master again for a second period. And then after that, the whole thing had just grown like wildfire. And everyone really, most of the lodges in London and much further afield were clamoring in on the bandwagon. They all wanted part of this. So much so that nobility, the Montagues, and then later aristocracy, from that point onwards, always became our Grand Master. And that is the position, you know, up to the present day. The Duke of Kent has been our Grand Master for 53 years. The burning question is who is going to succeed him? And, you know, we'd like to know that. Maybe you've got a theory on that, you know. Some names have been in the ringer. Prince Harry was a favourite, a hot favourite, but his sort of recent behaviour, yes, probably suggests that he will no longer take that position, which is, you know, a great shame. 1751 was actually a very, very important because, again, you've given us some good context about the issues and the formation of the ancient Grand Lodge. I believe there were also further issues about the practice of Royal Arch, which was pure ancient Freemasonry, but not recognized under the Premier Grand Lodge. And this was a big bone of contention when Lawrence de Motte effectively became the main driver in forming the ancients Grand Lodge. Interestingly, he was quite a character, a real character, and there was a lot of rivalry between the Grand Lodges, and the renegade ancients was by no means, you know, a small organization. They actually created, they were the main Grand Lodge that were driving lodges, districts abroad. They were forming far more military lodges and expedition lodges than the Premier Grand Lodge was. And one of the, well, you may also know that Lawrence de Motte was the reason that deacons were created, because he was quite a burly guy and I think riddled with gout. And he created the position of deacons so that they could carry him around at the Grand Lodge meetings. And I think that was actually a fact. The act that you were referring to, the Unlawful Associations Act of 1799, could have spelled the death of Freemasonry at that point in time. But because of the royal and aristocratic and noble connections, you know, then it carried on and it flourished. You know, that's how that happened.
Yeah, but, my goodness, what a long question.
Yeah. We had, of course, in those, you know, for many years, from 1751 to 1813, we had two Grand Lodges, both of whom were issuing separate certificates. And there was a lot of rivalry, but Lawrence de Motte sort of died, I think, towards the end of the century. And this, together with the Unlawful Associations Act, brought about the Articles of Union in 1813. So this is a little bit of the content that I put into my presentation before explaining the symbolism in Grand Lodge certificates. I hope I haven't hijacked the floor, and that what I've
not
said,
at all. It was very interesting.
Maybe a little of some nuggets of sort of interesting information for the brethren. Again,
Definitely.
points that I would make. Scotland, of course, has carried its Freemasonry into very, very, very far reaches of the world. Hong Kong, well, Israel. Scottish Freemasonry appears an awful lot of the place. I think it's probably more prominent in foreign jurisdictions than is English Freemasonry. And Bob, maybe you'd like to comment on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very interesting insight. The last part Bob just missed because he's been, I guess, something went wrong with his. Bob, are you back? I just let you back.
Okay, Bob.
For a sec, he was out.
Bob, can you hear me?
Wait a minute. Where's Bob? Oh, yes, Bob. Say something and you go to the first page.
Hello. Yes. I'm.
There you are.
What happened there?
There you are.
Yeah,
Bob,
I'm here.
Bob, I hope I didn't bore you to death.
No, I thought you were going to ask me a question.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Shall I pose the question again, just in case you didn't hear it? So
Yeah. Well, I certainly couldn't remember.
Just the question part, then. Otherwise, people will just
absolutely
are waiting, and it wouldn't be fair with them. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah, Bob. So the question sort of that I finished on was basically a recognition that that Scottish Freemasonry has been very, very successful in establishing lodges in many other parts of the world, probably more so than even the United Grand Lodge of England. So do you have a comment on that, please?
Well, it's really rather simple. Scotland's biggest export for centuries has been its people. Secondly, followed by its whiskey. So wherever the people have gone, they've founded lodges, and so we have, and you'll notice certainly the older lodges nearly always are located on the coast. So from Valparaiso, South America, to New Zealand, and Japan, various places, they're nearly always on the coast. And that's essentially where the Scots washed up on, And so they were bringing what they knew from home, and lodges were one of these things. And that's really the simple answer, I think. There you go.
Yep.
No, he's here.
Oh yeah, right, got you.
Yeah, Norman's here. So I think the answer is okay. Or you want some clarification, short one? Because no. David felt he's waiting, and
I'm sure
we don't want to get upset him.
On the list, and I'll be pleased to hear the next set of questions and answers. Thank you.
Definitely, sure. I mean, we have 3-4 guys waiting, and then you can have another minute or two. Please, David, floor is yours. Unmute yourself.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Just a very general question to allow you to speculate goes like this. So, all in all, have Grand Lodges been a blessing or a hindrance?
Well, that's a double-edged sword, that one, isn't it?
Coming back to the second lecture, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I think fundamentally human beings like to be organized, but they don't necessarily want to be organized too much. So certainly in Scotland, we don't mind being organized, but just allow us a good amount of wriggle room. Don't be dictatorial, because we'll walk away initially, and then we'll end up having a major falling out with you if you insist. So we certainly in Scotland, we can see from the independent lodges that went on for a long time, they just could not grasp why a Grand Lodge was needed. But in terms of an organisation, and of course I think this is the problem, was the situation in London was that it became an organisation, for good or ill, it became an organisation. And once you've got that situation, you then begin to standardise things. I mean, let me put it this way: if you've got a banking system, and you've got a head office of a bank, Bank of England, say, well, you can't have every other bank branch doing what it wants to do. Head office will say, no, you've got to use the same documents, you've got to use the same currency, you've got to open the office at the same time every day. And so standardization goes with a bureaucracy. And essentially that's what a Grand Lodge is. It's a controlling, directing bureaucracy. So if you want everyone to be more or less doing the same thing, a Grand Lodge is good. But when the pendulum goes so far that instead of being the head office of a fraternity, it becomes the head office of a business, then that's where I think things fundamentally go wrong, because Freemasonry is not a business, and trying to run it as a business contains all sorts of inherent problems. And we see that in different parts of the world, unfortunately.
Just want to say, Brother Robert, I have never heard such an eloquent way of splitting the baby with respect to that issue. Thank you very much.
Truly, King Solomon's answer, right? Let's give the floor to Shiva. He's from Singapore. Shiva, you have to speak up and you'll be on the first page. Shiva.
Yes. Hello, Brother Robert.
Hi again.
Hello again. Well, hello from Singapore, and fantastic lecture. So, just a very quick point with regards to Brother Norman's point about Scottish Masonry spreading out across the world. In Singapore, we have 2 Scottish lodges, and the lodge that I belong to, Lodge Elsa, practices the McBride ritual, which is one of the few lodges across the world that does that. But Brother Robert, it's a 2-part question with regards to practice, difference of practice between Scottish Constitution and the English Constitution. Now, in the Scottish Constitution, we call it the trestle board, and in the English Constitution, our brethren call it the tracing board. Now, I just wanted to get your view about what that difference is and what it means. And the second part of that question is, in the Scottish Constitution, we square the lodge, right? And I understand that this comes back to your point about the operative lodges being amalgamated into the Grand Lodge. And does that come from the old practices of the operative lodges, where the plan was initially drawn out across the floor in sandboxes, and hence we don't want to destroy the plan by crossing the floor?
Yeah, so there's a variety of different reasons for that. I think the sandbox idea is a good one. My understanding of the trestle board is that when it was laid on the floor, it would be a bit more difficult for people to actually see. So they were put on trestles. And my thinking is that trestles are like 3-legged supports, typically used by joiners. And so the board would be laid on these, which would increase the height considerably so that people could see it. Having said that, so that's one possible explanation, as well as the sandbox. But we also have images, admittedly a bit later, from some of these taverns where lodges met, and there would typically be a very large table in the middle of the room where the clientele would sit round it. So it wasn't a table such as we know it today. It was physically very large. So in order to go to another officer of the lodge, because that's where the lodge was meeting, you literally had to walk around this very large table to get to the candidate or whatever. And so this walking around the lodge was actually to physically walk around the table. Which one of those or all of those would apply, we'll probably never know for sure. Personally, I like the idea of the table because we have some very good engravings, particularly from France, oddly enough, of them sitting around very large tables. And it'd be impossible to walk across the room because the table was in the way. So you had to physically walk around it. So again, one of these things we were probably never going to know for sure. I prefer the table idea myself. Yeah.
And what about the difference between our English brethren calling it the tracing board?
Well, I think the tracing board is typically British, because they're tracing boards in Scotland as well. The similarities they are virtually identical from Scotland to England. And I strongly suspect that that's because England was the first place the ritual was ever printed. Whereas up until that point, Scots had always memorized the ritual. So when Samuel Pritchard publishes the first ritual, Masonry Dissected in 1730, when that's published, then everybody goes, oh, we don't need to memorize it anymore. Somebody's written it down for us, and what's not written, it's printed. And people are generally kind of lazy. So, getting a printed ritual also led to further standardization, and it started to import into Scotland a lot of practices that we would consider to be not Scottish. And so, and we can tell that. I mean, we have McBride ritual. I mean, Andrew McBride, whose son didn't die that long ago. Andrew McBride, when he was writing that ritual, he decided he wanted to remove the so-called foreign elements out of the ritual in order to try and get back to the purest form that existed originally. But it's never going to happen, is it? Because people just love to tinker with these things. They keep adding things. And I mean, as Norman was saying, there's the big, people loved the Royal Arch, and how could you not have the Royal Arch in a Grand Lodge? So it's a big problem. All human beings just naturally cannot leave things alone, And if you've got the Royal Arch, well, why can't you have the Knight Templars in there as well? And so it goes on. The same thing happened to our ritual and the elaborations, but eventually the tracing boards were imported from. We know this because the famous, I can't remember who it was. There was one famous individual who drew tracing boards for lodges in London, and his designs became pretty much standard, and they appear also in Scotland from a very early stage. So so that's the process. Whether it's right or not is another matter, of course. But to be fair, and here's another way. This is what I was getting at about the symbols. Scots didn't use symbols because they didn't need a symbol. They didn't need a tracing board because everything was delivered by mouth. It was an oral tradition. Only when things started to get printed and people wanted to have nice jewels and all that kind of stuff did we start getting these importations, shall we say. The big problem with that, of course, is we'll never know for sure what the oral version of the ritual was because it was not written down. So in that sense, the Grand Lodge of England is to be thanked for having the earliest printed ritual. Otherwise, we wouldn't know from one country to another, let alone what town to another everybody was doing. So that's just human nature, I think.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiva, for a very interesting question. And Bob, Brother Mgawa was in the quay, but I don't know whether he accidentally pushed the button or not. Floor is yours, brother. If you want to talk, please go ahead. Bro Mgawa.
Hi.
Yeah, please
Can
go
you
ahead.
hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good afternoon, brethren. Oh,
Hi.
well, good evening. Just a question from me. Brother Mgawa from Malawi, Lilongwe here. You mentioned earlier in one of the responses to a certain individual that one of the big exports for Scotland is its people. And you may know or may not know that Malawi has a very rich relationship with Scotland because of the missionary background. And a lot of missionaries that came to the country in the late 18th and 19th century. I was just curious to know whether there's been any study or analysis on the actual specific effects of missionaries on the spread of Freemasonry around the world, especially in our part of the world here in Southern Africa, where the Scottish missionaries had quite a big effect with, you know, the development and implementation of institutions and schools, etc.
Yeah.
That's my question. I hope you heard it.
Yes, sure did. Here we say that Malawi is the most Scottish country in Africa for that very reason. But that's a very good research project. I don't think anyone has investigated the background of these Scottish missionaries. Many of them would have been in the craft because at that time it was very popular amongst the Presbyterian clergy anyway. And we have a couple of lodges here where it really was for the ministers of the Church of Scotland. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a considerable overlap. And as, of course, as you know, as well as the missionary activities, we founded a few lodges in Malawi, did we not? There's still some there now. And in fact, the Grand Lodge of Scotland is supporting a school for deaf children in Malawi, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, there's very strong connections over the years. And I can't see how there could be no connection between those missionaries and Freemasonry, just nobody's researched it. Simple as that.
Thank you. I wonder that here in Georgia we had Englishmen for centuries. I mean, we even had Nobel taking oil from Baku through Georgia. We had Scottish people here, but how come Georgia had to establish its first Grand Lodge only in 2015? I still wonder how come nobody left this mark here in Georgia. Still things to clarify, I guess, and rectify in that regard.
We had a very famous lodge in St. Petersburg. I know that. So we were, I mean, I know it's quite far away from Georgia, but so there was a presence in the area, if not nearby. But Norman's comment about the presenting these certificates has just jogged my memory. And this is about these acts that we were talking about, Norman, the law passed by the government. Both Grand Lodges, both Scotland and England, seized the opportunity to say that, okay, because the government is imposing this duty upon us, that creates more work for us at Grand Lodge level. So what we're going to do now is everybody who's a Freemason must get a certificate from the Grand Lodge to prove that they're Freemasons. And of course, we'll charge you for the privilege of getting a Grand Lodge of England certificate. We'll add it into the initiation fee or whatever. But at the same time, I don't know if this happens in England, but certainly in Scotland, every year, a lodge in Scotland has to apply to Grand Lodge for an annual certificate. And that annual certificate allows them to function as a lodge for the next 12 months. That's exactly where this comes from, because the Grand Lodge, certainly in Scotland, said, if you want us to vouch for you to the government, you have to pay us for the certificate. And that's continued to the present day.
Can I respond to that point?
Sure. And I would ask Javad to be ready as after the comment of Norman.
Yeah. So basically, there is no demand for annual certification, but each lodge, after its installation, must make what's called an installation return, showing all of its members for the last 12 months. And we get a bill from the Grand Lodge for dues and charitable subscriptions. But one thing which is asked for when, often in America, when lodges in America want to receive visitors from other jurisdictions, they ask for a dues card. And in fact, I believe that was banned by the United Grand Lodge of England when they amalgamated in 1830. We just don't have that. So that's the point. No, you're a Mason. Year by year, your lodge is certainly billed unless they notify the Grand Lodge of a resignation or an exclusion, or you die, or any other reasons that may have.
Yeah, that's just to finish on that. That's exactly what we do. There's an installation return for which they have to pay for. But I think all that happens is that in Scotland we acknowledge the payment of the money by giving them an annual certificate. So it's the same, exactly the same process, exactly the same. Yeah.
Brother Javad, yes, Aubrey, I saw it is noted, and then floor is yours, and then Eder Reeves. Javad?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you for giving me the floor. I would like to thank Brother Bob for his wonderful lecture. I have a very simple question, because in Turkey we do not have Mark Masonry. So this is about Mark Masonry. According to the understanding of ancient Masonry, there should be only 3 degrees, as you said. And for that reason, the Grand Lodge of Scotland included Mark Masonry in the 2nd degree. Now, today, not that time, today, is Mark Masonry under the Grand Lodge of Scotland, or do they have a upper administration, in your words, a head office?
Yeah, that's it's a very good question, but it's the same old story, because when we're talking about Scotland, nothing's quite straightforward. What happened was that when these operative lodges drew the Grand Lodge's attention to the existence of the marked degree, the Grand Lodge of Scotland was a bit embarrassed, to say the least, because it showed that they didn't know what its lodges were actually doing, you know. So in that embarrassment, they didn't tackle the problem immediately, probably scratching their heads and wondering what to do about it. And in that period of delay, the body that was formed to look after the Royal Arch and cryptic degrees and others, called the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland, they claimed the marked degree because Grand Lodge, it appeared that Grand Lodge was not interested in it. By claiming that degree, Grand Lodge suddenly realized that they were going to lose control over the ceremony practiced by its lodges. So they came to an agreement that they would share the mark. So you can take your mark in the lodge in Scotland, or if for whatever reason you do not, you can take your mark in the Royal Arch chapter. And so, and I'm one of those very unusual people. I took my 3 degrees and then was hijacked by my proposer to his Royal Arch chapter, where I took my mark degree. So, and I think there's definitely a little bit of a competition between the chapters and the lodges in Scotland, because chapters were jealous of the fact that we had 3 degrees and they didn't. And so by adding the mark to their system, they got 3 degrees. And to this day, if you join a Royal Arch chapter, if you haven't taken your mark in the lodge, you have to take your mark degree in the Royal Arch chapter. And after the mark, you have the excellent master's degree, followed by the Royal Arch degree. And that gives them 3 degrees, which makes them equivalent, if you like, in terms of numbers of degrees, equivalent to the Blue Lodge as opposed to the Red chapter. So, so yes, it can be a bit confusing. And we don't have any mark lodges as they do in England, but it's just the way it is. It's the way it happened. So that's the way it is in Scotland.
Jawad, you understood the answer? You're satisfied?
Yes, but still I couldn't understand. Who looks after mark degree? The Grand Lodge or another upper administration?
Yeah, well, there's 2. The mark degree is governed by the 2 bodies, by Grand Lodge and this other body, the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland.
Thank you.
There's 2
So
bodies.
whichever gives you the rank degree, you are under subject of that. Can you say that?
Yes, that's right. If you take, you see, I took my mark
From where
degree,
you take, they're subject of that jurisdiction, let's say, of
that's
that
right. So
organization.
I got my mark degree certificate from the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter, and I didn't get it from Grand Lodge. And just to complicate things even more, the content of the mark degree is different in the lodge to the chapter.
So it's not the real mark that you're getting there. The mark is here.
Very interesting.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Jawad. Now, Aubrey from Chile, and actually Scott from Chile, and then Eden Reeves. And then we have Abraham. Please, floor's yours.
Thank you very much. There is evidence to support the existence of private lodges under the Grand Lodge of England. These are lodges which are not detailed anywhere, but they do exist. Does the same exist in Scotland, Bob?
The answer is yes. The differences you see in, I think it's because in Scotland, because we've got minutes of a lodge, in order to compare them, we would want to see minutes of those lodges, and they don't exist. But equally, we do have references to lodges that don't have minutes and do not now exist. But the problem for the historian comes down to the simple fact that if there is no evidence to examine, then there's no real conclusion or no real discussion you can have in any meaningful way other than to say, well, these entities existed, but we don't know very much about them. It's really about all you can say, which is a pity, because I think it'd be very, very interesting if records existed. But no, we do have references. I know, for example, there was a lodge called General Cumberland Lodge, and that was obviously after 1745, or more precisely 1746, was obviously an attempt to get on the right side of the government's main general for suppressing the Jacobite rebellion. But That doesn't exist. We just know it by reference in one lodge's records to the existence of that lodge, and that's all we know. We know nothing else.
I'm referring specifically to today. Today's
Yes, it's
time.
not the history he's asking for.
Oh, existence of lodges today.
Of private lodges, private lodges who report direct to the United Grand Lodge of England, but do not appear anywhere on the list of lodges.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about Grand Secretary's lodges. Yes, I know exactly what you mean. This is lodges that the commoners like you and I can't attend.
Exactly.
Yes.
Can you share at least what is the existent all about, without going into the content, of course?
Some Grand Lodges, and I think I know exactly what you're talking about. Some Grand Lodges have granted charters, and that's a physical piece of paper, to certain lodges, but refuse to admit or acknowledge that they exist. And we know that. I mean, I know that actually happens, but it's a way of excluding people from what may be seen as an internal decision-making body that they don't want anyone participating in.
Very interesting.
Very delicate.
Very interesting. It's particularly delicate and particularly interesting because I have knowledge of one here in Chile, in Santiago.
Yes, I'm pretty sure they exist here as well. Certainly one or two in London, I believe. Whether they actually are active or whether they exist in name only, I don't know. But and frankly, I mean, it goes against the Scottish mentality to have such things. It means that, you know, they are essentially clandestine lodges. And if they're clandestine, then they're not Masonic.
Indeed.
Yeah, but if they are granted the charter, how they can be clandestine?
Because they won't admit they exist. But in order to satisfy their own Masonic way of thinking, they produce a piece of paper.
Can I add a point?
I'd be most interested to hear you.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so Aubrey, we do have some lodges which are called time immemorial lodges, and I believe that these are lodges which predate 1717. They were lodges that didn't choose to put their lot in with the Premier Grand Lodge, and therefore never received a number. And one or two of these lodges, I think, still exist. I'm not aware of any clandestine lodges. I hope they don't exist. You know, yeah, that would be certainly.
Yeah.
That's about the definition.
Yeah, exactly.
What is clandestine?
We've all heard about the so-called lodge that exists in the Vatican, and I think that might be the same kind of situation. I don't know. I mean, the problem is when you hear this stuff, well, we're asking, well, Norman or Aubrey, give us proof, and that's but there may not be any proof. I know I'm asking a very difficult question, but
indeed, that's what I'm trying to find out. In fact, the number here, I think it has a name called St. George, and I think its number is 1064.
Of that lodge, or the closed one?
Of the Grand Lodge of Chile.
Private lodge.
Private lodge in Chile.
Yes.
Right. Well,
directly under the Grand Lodge of England.
Well,
Okay.
England does have, it has districts overseas.
Yes, but it doesn't appear. It doesn't appear, and that lodge doesn't appear in the district, which is south.
Could I ask a question? I am aware of a lodge by the name of Britannia. Is
Yes,
that the same
so
thing?
am I. No, that's my lodge.
Oh, right. Okay.
The Grand Lodge of
That's my
Scotland.
memory playing tricks.
That's my lodge, the Grand Lodge. Mine in Christmas
Yeah,
Lodge.
I don't know. Norman and I don't know. I think that's what we're going to say. I think we probably take the diplomatic exit and say we don't know.
Yeah, I am aware of time immemorial lodges which exist here. Not many of them, and they probably do not have a number. We have many lodges which may have a specific theme. You know, we have the Navy Lodge, which,
yes, of course,
members such as the Duke of Edinburgh.
Yes.
And you know, we have many lodges, you know, that may represent a certain sort of interest. We have internet lodges, fishing lodges, all sorts of lodges, judo lodges, things like that. So, but clandestine, no.
That's it. Yeah, we find that concept quite strange. Yeah. Anyway,
just to summarize. So in Chile there is this private lodge which 1064, which belongs to UGLE, right? That's what you said. But the immemorial ones which Norman refers to are based in England, and they might have different themes for their existence. It might be aristocratic ones, or might be just sport kind of a fiction or something like that, right? Fishing, I don't know, volleyball lodges or something. But can I ask you one thing, Norman? In England, those lodges immemorial without the number, are they part of UGLE?
Yes, they are. They are.
Just without number, and no charter from the UGLE, of course, because they are kind of older than they.
Correct. Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have attended one of these lodges in my infancy as a Mason, and I don't really remember too much about it now, but it may be something I can do a little bit more research about and bring back to another session if that's agreeable.
Okay. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, if I could just add
just
an example.
I'll sum up here, because not to lose it, please, you can add, of course. Can we say that not topic, but we can have some sort of just one lecture on this issue, but presented by Aubrey, Robert, and Norman, because you are the most experienced guys here who have some understanding of those things. Would it be okay?
Well,
I would prefer not to get involved until I
okay.
got to the bottom of this. My background to this was I was informed by a friend of mine who is Chilean and is a member of this lodge. And I said, well, I don't believe it. I've never heard of it. It doesn't exist. Can't believe it. And he's faithfully promised to take me along to a meeting. If and when it does happen, then I would be more than happy to come back and make the comments. But
Brother Aubrey,
from what I've heard, it's not just a craft lodge. There is a Royal Arch lodge in the same building, and
Brother Aubrey, Could you provide me the name again of that lodge? You said St. George?
St. George.
St. George, number 1066?
I think it was 1034 or 10 something or that. Okay. It's 10 something or that.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do would be allow us to do a little bit of research, and then we'll come back.
Yeah,
another session.
Maybe Norman said the same thing. That's why I wanted to kind of sum up it. Maybe we can give it a try if you're okay. If not, then we can just leave it where it is and have some comments if you would want to share with us in future. Would that work?
Yeah, we'll see what we can find
out. Would for me.
Okay, excellent.
That's good enough for me.
Excellent. Yeah. If you want to share something in the future, I'll have it marked and I'll remind in 1 or 2 lectures ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, please, Norman, you want to comment something?
I was going to put a quick question to Bob. In the Grand Lodge of Scotland, how are the Grand Stewards chosen each year?
They are proposed by lodges via the province. It's largely a ceremonial position, and they do carry out some functions, but it's not like England. We don't have a Grand Steward's Lodge, for example. So I think the intention was originally to have a Grand Steward's Lodge, but it just never got off the ground. So, short and sweet.
Okay, I ask this in case there's a parallel with England, because we have a very quaint way of appointing Grand Stewards. Basically, we have 19 lodges which we call red apron lodges. They're pretty old lodges, and they have a unique annual obligation, which is to supply a Grand Steward to the Grand Lodge, for the year. And in practice, the master of one of these 19 red apron lodges becomes the Grand Steward for the year. Now, it's very much sought after, because for that year, the master is a grand officer. He isn't when the year finishes, but it's a double-edged sword, because the Grand Stewards have got to pay for the imbalance of the Grand Festival when the new Grand Officers are appointed. Now, in practice, there are something like 400 people dining in very, very good premises, very good meals, very, very good wine. The attendees have to pay a ticket price, which may be something like £75 per head. But the real cost of providing is much more, and the Grand Stewards have to shell it out. So that's what happens in England.
Yeah, no, it's very different here. You see, the Scottish attitude, and maybe it's a bit simplistic, but we consider that all Freemasons are on the level, and therefore when we start introducing distinctions between Masons of the same rank and ability, we end up with something that's not quite Freemasonry. So we don't have any lodges here that are specific to any kind of occupation or interest or hobby or like a Grand Steward. So all these things I think are very interesting, but I think they are a very English way of thinking about Freemasonry, because they simply don't exist here in any. I mean, we have Grand Stewards, but that's all they are. They get a white stick and they escort Grand Office bearers into every meeting, every communication, that kind of thing. But that's all there is to it. So it's similar but different, I suppose.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. The question has been answered, and we are all intrigued. So, Aubrey, can I mute you now?
Yes, by all means.
Okay. Okay, just
I'll
to
mute
keep.
myself.
No, okay, thank you. So now the question from Grand Lodge of Georgia, DP. Hello, Acacia number 2, Brother David. I have one question. Was Sir Oliver Wardrop the UK's first chief commissioner in Georgia in 1919, 1921, member of any lodge? Do we know? Maybe Norman knows about it, or Bob. Any idea?
That's a research question. I think Norman will agree. We'd have to go and check some records. And that, of course, this is one of the difficulties in the present emergency. Very difficult to access a lot of records. So if people like me make a statement and it turns out to be wrong, you'll please forgive me, because I'm not in my library in the office. So normally everything I would be able to verify, but that's an example of we simply don't know. We'll be able to find out, but we don't know at the moment.
Definitely. He has played a role during Georgia's independence, so it is quite an interesting part of our history. And yes, thank you, DP, for that question. Now the floor goes to Eden Reeves. Eden?
Yes.
You're here. Please, go ahead.
Just want to thank Brother Bob. Thanks for a wonderful lecture. Well, first of all, I hail from the Grand Lodge of Liberia. So I want to say thank you for the lecture. I really enjoyed it. I also enjoyed the discussions that we had since then. My question to Bob is, I've recently learned, maybe about a year ago, that the lodge that gave the first charter to Prince Hall in the U.S. was a Scottish lodge, or was operating under a warrant from a Scottish Grand Lodge. Do you have any information about that? Or do you know how you go about getting information on that? Because Liberia is the only Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Africa, and it's the oldest Grand Lodge. It's been around for 152 years.
Yeah, actually, my understanding is that Prince Hall obtained the charter of an English travelling lodge. I don't think it was Scottish. And in fact, I think what happened was the English, in their typical magnanimous way, when the regiment was leaving the area, and it may well have been New York, I can't recall, but when the regiment was leaving, normally the lodge would go with the regiment, but they left their warrant with Prince Hall, and he continued to allow that lodge to exist. He was probably the first master, and again, remember, I'm going by memory, but Prince Hall it essentially owes its existence to the Grand Lodge of England, as far as I can remember, anyway. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I need to do more research. One other question I have. It was because of that. Honestly, I don't have any proof of this or know anything about this, but there was an older Mason that he's now passed away. But he told me probably about 10 years ago, we're just having a little discussion once, and he told me that the Grand Master of England is in one of those secret lodges that you were just talking about. And I just thought it was a crazy idea. We laughed about it, and I never mentioned it again until Aubrey mentioned this thing about his secret lodge. So I don't know if it's true or not. So my question would be to Norman: what's the lodge of the Grand Master of England? Is it known?
Yeah, can I answer that?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so our Grand Master of 53 years duration, which is the longest period that any Grand Master has ever served in the history, does not do very much. in practice, we have 4 Grand Lodge meetings per year, and we call those the quarterly communications. We also have another meeting, which is the festival meeting, when new Grand Officers, are invested. Now, the Grand Master attends to the investitures of new Grand Officers in alternate years. One year, he will attend to craft Grand Officers. In another year, he'll attend to Grand Officers in the Holy Royal Arch, because the rulers of craft and Royal Arch are exactly identical over here. To my knowledge, those are the only lodge meetings that he ever attends, and that's sort of really one a year. Is really titular. All of the real work is done by our Pro-Grand Master, Peter Jeffrey Lowndes. That's how it is. So if one was to say, yes, what lodge does the Grand Master belong to? We don't know. He's probably an honorary member of many, many individual lodges, but he's the number one, he's the top of the hierarchy. So when it comes to Grand Officers, he's number one. That's as much as I can give you. Is that satisfactory?
That's fine, thank you. Like I said, I never made much of what this Mason told me. I just thought he was just joking about it until the discussion a few minutes ago that made it come to my mind. That's all.
Well,
thank you.
I've been fortunate enough to have been invested by him twice on 2 separate occasions, and it was nice. Of course, we toast him very, very frequently at every single meeting, and the amount of wine we drink to his good health, we hope preserves him in good standing, especially free of the coronavirus, which some of his nephews, succumbed to but got over. So we're pleased about that.
Norman, can you share in which lodge he was initiated or raised? Do we know that?
No, I don't actually know that, but what we do know is that in the rumor mill, that Freemasons are very good at creating. There is talk of Prince Edward appearing and probably going through 3 degrees, in a day. It would undoubtedly be a military lodge, probably the Navy Lodge, because that does seem to attract some of the most senior figures that we know in Freemasonry. So as far as the Duke of Kent, no, I don't know where he was initiated, but these things sort of, they're not really published. They are rumored that somebody was seen entering the Grand Lodge building on such and such a date, and but we don't know for a fact. But my guess would be that lodges like the Navy Lodge would be probably right at the top of the list of where our potential Grand Masters get initiated, passed and raised. Thank you, Norman, for that answer. Yeah, it may have its rationale why his history is not public. Okay, Abraham, floor's yours. And just to remind, procedure-wise, I'm not asking any questions. We've been here 2.5 hours, so please keep it short and interesting. Abraham, then Renan.
Okay, Brother David, should I wait till later to propose, or should I?
Oh, if it's that part, then you should wait. I remember that one.
So
it's not a question.
So I still have I still have some information I want to address a previous, I think it was Chavat, who had asked about, or had made mention about the Royal Lodge. Here in America, our Royal Lodge is governed by, on a state level, you have the grand chapter of the state, right, and then on more federally or international, we have the General Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons International, which its history goes back to 24th October of 1797, I believe, is when the General Grand Chapter, and they govern all of the local state grand chapters in the United States. As you know, here in the United States, the Craft Lodge, or the Blue Lodge as we call it, practicing York Rite, only confers the first, the three symbolic degrees, the EA, the FC, and the MM degrees. And then the York Rite would then take over to confer the chapter, council, and commandery orders, the chapter degrees, the councilor degrees, and the
Abraham,
order.
I should interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bob wrote that he has to leave soon, and as you don't have question, but the information which you will have opportunity to share a little bit later, then let's give floor to Renan, so he has opportunity to ask his question to Bob. Otherwise, we just may lose the opportunity, and it won't be fair. Brother Renan, floor is yours.
Thank you, Brother David. I'm not going to ask any question.
Okay.
I just want to tell that when I was working on Irish Freemasonry, I saw that the military lodge number 441 has initiated 14 black people and pioneered to form the Prince Hall lodges. It's not the Grand Lodge of Scotland, but it's the Grand Lodge of Ireland.
Oh, it's answering Eden's question, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you.
What date was that? When was that? Do we know when that was, Renan?
1775.
Really? Okay.
1775. Wow.
In Boston.
In Boston.
Yeah.
Okay. Note taken. We have
Cleo.
Cleo. Yes. You. Okay. Go ahead, Cleo. Floor is yours. Sorry, just 1 second. Renan, you want to add something? Or can I mute?
Thank you.
Can I mute you? Okay. Thank you. Cleo, floor is yours, please.
Okay, so a good book to reference about the landmarks of Prince Hall's history is a book by John Hairston, who worked really hard to rewrite and research and rewrite the, make clarifications on the origins on Africa Lodge #1. The book is called Landmarks of Our Fathers, The Critical Analysis of the Start and Origin of African Lodge #1. And he also has his lectures presented at various American lodges on YouTube. So if you can just Google his name and the title of Landmarks of Our Fathers, you'll find his videos on YouTube as well.
Good.
Cleo already shared the. Sorry, who's please don't use the share screen button. Okay, thank you. We're back. We're safe again. Cleo already shared in the chat room the details, the name, everything, so we can refer to it. And also, Cleo, I should read that the Oscar Elaine, right? Elaine has a presentation on clandestine Freemasonry. If anyone wants to see that and read it. So yes, Cleo. Okay, you're done. Then we have Carlos Varenti. Carlos, floor is yours,
David.
please.
Hello, David.
Hello,
you listen me right?
Yes, everything's
well,
fine.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very pleased and happy of these lessons that we are receiving. Sorry about my language. I'm Spanish country speaking. I'm trying to do my best about the English. But there is a quick question I have to say to Bob, that reading Harry Kerr, World of Freemasonry, a very nice book, in one of the chapters that say 600 years of craft ritual, he makes a statement that it puzzles me a lot. And he said, let me begin saying that Freemasonry did not begin in Egypt, Palestine, or Greece, or Rome. It all started in London, England, in the year 1356. And it started with a trade organization called the London Masons Company. If he can specify why Harry Kerr makes this statement, because 1356, it's a very early date, comparing the 1599 that we have in the Mary Chapel's records.
Yeah, Harry Carr was probably one of the best Masonic historians we've had in this country. He was a past master of Quater Coronati Lodge in London, and he wrote numerous books and made some wonderful translations and transcriptions of Masonic documents. My only problem with Harry, and unfortunately I never met him before he passed away, and this is always the problem that historians have. You can pick a point in time in the past and say something started there, and that might be the case. But my difficulty, or many historians' difficulty, is let us see the continuity from that date to the present time. And unless there is a continuous reference on a regular basis in the intervening period, there's no way of knowing what took place in almost 700 years ago. There's no way of knowing if what took place 700 years ago has in any way got any similarities with what happens today. The big problem we have is, of course, that the reference that he's talking about, I think, is the foundation of the London livery companies. And a livery company has no comparison to a Masonic lodge. We are essentially comparing an apple with an orange. There are similarities.
Absolutely.
In that they're both round and they're both edible, but that doesn't mean to say they're exactly the same thing. And so until we can actually link the two together as being the same, they will remain an apple and an orange. And I think Harry Carr, he could be quite mischievous, and he would quite often make these kind of statements in order to get people like me all upset. And he does it beautifully. But that's probably the one major point of departure that Harry and I have.
Thank you very much, Brother Bob.
I must interfere, because I read that talk, 600 years of ritual. Harry Carr, late Harry Carr, didn't say it was a Mason lodge. It was a guild. So he made it very clear. So I remember it because I wrote a paper on the rituals and I read that item.
Yeah.
So I very clearly remember that he mentioned it. It was not a Masonic lodge, it was a guild. Thank you.
Right. So here's the problem. All the guilds in England were destroyed by Henry VIII in 1547. He not only, I mean, we call it this was supposedly the Reformation, but Henry VIII had an eye to all these people's money their land and their money, etc. So he suppressed all the guilds in England and stole their money, did away with all their religious practices. So all these English guilds ceased to exist in 1547. And this is the problem I have with Harry's statement. He says it begins in 1356, but we know that the organizations he's talking about were completely and utterly destroyed in 1547. So, you know, here we are 500 years, almost 500 years later, still asking, well, where is the continuity between those dates and the present day? And that's why I mean that we have a big problem in that sense. If they were completely destroyed, and we don't have copies of the ritual either, by the way, if they were completely destroyed, there's no way of comparing the guilds with lodges. And a guild, of course, is not a lodge. It's quite different from a lodge. Everyone knew about about a guild. The lodges were secret. And so, as I say, I think Harry took great pleasure in poking people like me in the eye with these provocative statements.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, guys.
Thank you. And Bob, we have 3 minutes, or you have to go?
Yeah, we have 3 minutes. Okay.
Okay, Shiva, very quick, and this will be the final question, please.
Yes, very quick. Actually, Brother Robert, this is very quick around your, actually it's a follow-up to that, the last statement, and your recent Facebook posts around questions on the early lodges, the earliest lodges, and how the Grand Lodge of Scotland has decided to define early lodges, not in terms, and the continuity problem is an issue. So how they've decided to ask lodges to provide evidence of early minutes of the first thing. Yeah, I'm not sure if all the brethren on the call have been able to read your Facebook posts. This is what I was going to ask. Could you maybe expound a little bit on that principle?
Yeah, I mean, Masons in particular, I have to say, make this mistake where, you know, I'll give you an example. There is a very, mentioned it already, the Operative Lodge in Melrose, the last independent lodge in Scotland to join Grand Lodge. It joined in 1891. It was an operative lodge that built Melrose Abbey, and they built it, maintained it until the Reformation. And so the claim is made that because they were an operative lodge in 1736, they claimed that their date of origin was the date of the beginning of the abbey there in 1132. That's fine, but it's based on an assumption that there was a lodge there in 1132, and it's the same lodge in 1736. But of course, there is no record of continuity between 1136 and 1132 and 1736. So the Grand Lodge, that's why they asked, well, and we need to see your earliest records to give proof of continuity. And of course, nobody can produce records from 1132. And so, again, they took a very, in my opinion, a very bold decision not to accept the claims of these early lodges as being even older than they actually are. But that in itself created its own problems, as I've described with Mother Co-winning. So, yeah, tricky, but I hope that answers it. It's the continuity that's important here.
It is such a pleasure to stay over. Yeah, please. You want to add something? Bob?
Oh, that's me.
Okay.
I'm done.
It is such a pleasure to stay and listen to the lecture, and the discussion is not less interesting than the lectures because it brings up so much from different perspectives, different points of views, and thank you for everyone for participating and sharing. First of all, I will thank you for Brother Bob. I will wrap up today's meeting. It is almost 3 hours with the lecture, with the recording, while some of you came, kind of entered the room even 1 hour earlier than lecture started. So it's just the heroism in my eyes to stay so long at the screens. Again, thank you so much. We will meet May 9th. Which is Saturday, as I think, and we will have plenty of time again to go through the next topic. Thank you for organizers. For recording purposes, I will just mention that brothers from Grand Lodge of Georgia, Grand Lodge of Lithuania, and some brothers from, including Bob from Scotland and from London, of course, support this initiative. And thank you for all the kind words that we received, and especially for those who kind of offered, generously offered their financial support to continue these lectures on. So far, we're so well. Capacities are quite enough, and thank you for your suggestions and offers. Now, I will give floor to Adam because, sorry, Abraham, to finish this with a nice toast, I think. It's still being
Thank
recorded,
you.
so it will stay in the history, Abraham. It should be the
Thank
greatest
you.
toast ever.
Thank you. Brethren, as you know, today in the United States and probably in Mexico, they're celebrating Cinco de Mayo. But I spoke to David last time about ending off this meeting with a toast. So at this time, brethren and all those present, if you have an adult beverage of your choice handy, please prepare it. If not, prepare your charging glass. And I would like to propose a toast. First, to the Grand Lodge of Scotland and to the Grand Master, the most worshipful brother, William Ramsay McGee, the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, to the great architect of the universe, and also to Brother Bob Cooper, to Brother David Chichinadze, and to all the brethren present here. Thank you, Bob, for constantly enlightening us with that great Masonic light which we all came into that door seeking. And you continue to not only provide light, but you also provide wonderful fellowship here by giving us this great opportunity to bond, to share our ideas, to exchange knowledge, and to further expand our living stones. So for that, a toast to you, Salanchi.
Thank you.
So mote it be, right?
There we go.
Yes,
so
good stuff.
Can I just say, happy to meet, sorry to part, and happy to meet them.
Okay. Our next meeting, I'll give you a Scottish version of that. I'll try and remember to give you a Scottish version.
Okay, all set, toast made. I will stop recording, and off the records, we are free to talk about many stuff.